Hello and welcome to episode 106 of Modiga människor, or in English, brave people. And my name is Soja. Yeah, and the name Modiga människor is because this is originally a Swedish channel. But today I will speak to Dr. Peter Canady and Dr. Guy Hatchard from New Zealand. And before you meet them, I will just remind you that this channel is also on Rumble, Spotify, YouTube, and Podbean. And I have my own homepage called modigamänniskor.se, and you can see all the episodes there. And you can also support the channel in two ways. Either you share the episodes or you support it with a donation. All information is in the text. And I'm greatly, deeply thankful for both. And now I will say hello to Dr. Guy and Dr. Peter. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So fantastic. I mean, the internet and this whole thing, it works.
We're a long way away, but we are happy to meet you here today. Wonderful.
Yeah. And I'm so delighted to have you both here. Do you want to do a short tell us shortly about yourself? We can start with you, Guy.
Well, my undergraduate degree is in theoretical physics, and my PhD is in psychology. I have an interest in the development of consciousness and meditation and natural health, particularly Ayurveda. I worked in the USA for Genetic ID, now known as Food Chain ID, which is a company that does PCR testing of food for safety and certification to allow bulk trading of food free of genetic modification. I've traveled, worked in many different countries, but basically resident here in New Zealand, and very glad to be with you today.
Thank you. And you, Dr. Peter?
Yes, I've in Massachusetts in the United States, I graduated from medical school. It's getting on 45 years ago now, actually quite a long time, but I trained originally in respiratory medicine and critical care medicine and practiced that specialty for 12 years in Denver in Colorado. And then had a change of career and began training in diagnostic radiology in Wisconsin, and I completed that in 1997. And then after a few years in community practice, I joined the faculty at Creighton University Medical School in Omaha, Nebraska, where I was the director of chest radiology there for 8 years. And then discovered New Zealand in 2009 when I was invited by a colleague at one of the conferences to come in and fill in for her colleague. And so that was my first introduction to New Zealand, and came back again in 12 and was offered a position as a consultant radiologist in a public-private partnership practice here in New Zealand. And I've been here since 2013 in one form or another. Just recently retired actually it's now last March, a year ago now.
Thank you. Yeah, I came in contact with you, and I know also that somewhere along the way you kind of saw through the narrative around this COVID situation.
I was, I have a certain expertise in how groups function, network theory. And I was called in the beginning of 2021 and started a dialogue with a number of scientists involved in advising the government. And at some point, I started to ask questions about safety. And as I dived further into it with my background in biotechnology, I realized that there were really serious safety issues involved here for individuals. But there's a broader narrative too when we look at the whole biotechnology endeavor around the world. And there are big safety issues. We can see here a history of experimentation that is highly risky. And so I basically, about the middle of 2021, I came to a brick wall. I realized that the dialogue, the government dialogue, the scientific dialogue around the government was just not going to go into the safety issue for individuals and for biotechnology in general. And at that point, I started to blog. I've set up my website, hatchardreport.com, which is, along with many other groups here in New Zealand, are basically examining the science and trying to straighten out what is being hidden and what needs to change, right through to the political structure in this country as well. So that's of course, I've been involved before with issues around the regulation of herbal medicine. I'm an advocate of herbal medicine and so on, natural approaches to health. So I have a history of that.
Yeah, and you, Peter?
I have to confess that in the beginning, I was not immediately aware that this was going to be a process that we've now come to pretty close to the full knowledge of what's behind it, at least in respect to the medical aspects and the safety aspects. I kind of said, well, all right, yeah, it's usual that most epidemics, especially of known viruses such as coronaviruses, tend to be best managed through isolating the sick people and letting the herd immunity be naturally acquired. And it took a little bit before it became clear that that was not going to be their plan, and that everything sort of fell into the realm that the only way to approach this is going to be a vaccine or a injection, not that word, but a injection. And so that was the concern I had at that time. And so when we discovered that there was not really an emphasis on early treatment or even a desire to look for it, then I think we had a bit of a different look at it. And that's when I began to look at some of the research that had been available on the topic.
I think the philosophy here that is grown up behind biotechnology is very interesting. When you look at theory of evolution, the idea has grown that evolution is really a sort of game of chance. It's a mutagenic game of chance. And therefore, you can interfere with genetic processes because they're changing anyway. Whereas there's another perspective that's gaining ground through research, is that the underlying laws of nature, the physical laws of nature, have given rise to a stable structure. So that, what has happened really is the isolation of knowledge. Different disciplines have become very narrow. People are very isolated in their discipline, and they feel they can, take decisions and change things at one level of natural law, one level of, manifestation of nature, and that there won't be broader consequences. Whereas what you see is that the DNA is really at the interface between a more abstract virtual field of consciousness and between the material world that we sort of project into through our actions and perceptions. And that stability of DNA is something that's evolved over millions of years. So we have a symbiotic relationship with our environment, with our foods. And I wrote a book in 2018 where I looked at the role that DNA-based foods play in maintaining our health. And of course, our whole diet around the world is shifting into highly processed foods, into designer foods, designer meats, and so on. Our body doesn't have any evolutionary context to deal with these. And the pandemic, it's tied up with that. It's people playing God to a large extent. There's a lot of hubris involved.
I think that's the sort of thing you see with the statements coming out from the spokesman at the World Economic Forum. I think there's a Dr. Yavali who's actually made those statements overtly. Havali, I think is his name. And it is hubris. And it's like, it's something that I guess is really a very characteristic feature that we're seeing now adopted by governments as well, who have their opinions about the only way that things should be done. And there is not a sense of recognition of the sovereignty of the individual to make their own medical decisions. That goes into their body.
Yeah, but and you talk.
No,
you can say.
No, I was just thinking, it is a giant game of chance, whereas in fact, it's, nature is inherently cooperative, and what the way we're playing it is that it is inherently competitive, that you can just throw new things into the mix and see who survives. But when you're dealing with DNA, you shouldn't be talking about who survives, because you're talking about the survival of not just people, but our higher abilities. No one really understands how our kind of rational processes, our processes of enjoyment and being empathetic and truly moral and human, how those arise. But they're definitely embedded in our physiology, in our biotechnology, in our biome, and so on. So we shouldn't be playing around with these. We should be really very careful. And there are such fantastic avenues that we can look into. There's such great potential in the plant kingdom for healing properties that we need to investigate and understand, and in dietary and nutritional areas. These are actually the things that underpin our health. Our health is guaranteed by what we eat and the exercise we take and the enjoyment that we have and the philosophical heights that we reach. These are the real things that guarantee 95% of our health. And we should be working with these. And in fact, there is some research which showed, for example, if you eat a plant-based diet, you're 70% less chance of being hospitalized, or 73% actually, with COVID. So there you are. These are fruitful avenues for science to look at, rather than jumping into the absolute basis of life and saying, well, if I just change a bit here and there, I wonder what will happen. It's like it's not Lego bricks that we're dealing with here, whereas people are treating them like Lego bricks. Well, we'll just take this little apart and we'll put them together and we'll see whether it works. That is not the kind of safety that biotechnology requires.
I think what you're getting at is really the very issue that we've not really faced before, because these inoculations, these products, for the first time are attempting to employ genetic code as a form of so-called protecting against disease, things that we traditionally expected these products to do, and we find that they don't do that. But before this, we had taken pieces of an organism, say bacterium or virus or whatever it may be, and from that we had charged our internal immune system to respond to and be prepared for an attack by the real organism. But we had never been using effectively genetic codes in these kinds of products before, and that's where all of the after effects and the unknown effects that Dr. Hatchard is referring to were going to come about. And it's too, I mean, the whole cellular apparatus and the tissue apparatus, all the things that are constructed from the cells on upwards in increasing levels of complexity, just are unpredictable. You can't say, well, okay, there is one thing we're going to change here, and we're going to have one effect from that. It's impossible, and it's really quite naive and really quite arrogant, to be honest, to suspect you can do that.
This idea that biotechnology is sort of random is being overturned. I mean, there was some research published in 2017 by Dr. Zachary Blount, and he found that evolution is repeatable. If you go to different islands completely separated from one another, and you look at evolution, you find that the same patterns occur. And then he wanted to work with microorganisms, and he found that as generations go, as thousands of generations go by, that there are specific patterns that emerge, and these are the stable patterns of life that are grounded in the underlying laws of nature, the physical laws of nature. So this is very important, because this is an important sort of argument. Is life random, or is it repeatable? Does it have structure? Does it have a fundamental kind of structure? This is one feature of COVID, has been that it has mutated at very, very high rates. It far more than viruses do generally mutate at. And this indicates that it's not a stable structure. In fact, it's being used as an argument to suggest that it is a man-made virus, because its symptoms have been changing rapidly, its infectivity has been changing rapidly. It's not a stable structure. And that's what you face when you start to create a lot of biotechnology, when someone, an individual, starts to create biotechnology structures, genetic structures, and then starts to sort of see, well, what will happen if we do this? You're introducing instability into an enormously complex system. I mean, it's trillions and trillions of cells, but you are one whole person. I'm Guy Hatchard, and I know I'm one whole person, but I'm made up of trillions of cells working. So you have the wholeness, the completeness of the person, but you have all the parts. And the whole is more than the sum of the parts, but the whole relies on the parts. So if you start to mess around with the part here and there aren't things that are a long way out of place here. There are homeostatic mechanisms. I like to think of it about as sort of like 9/11, where you had 6,000 planes up in the air, you had 5,000 airports, and suddenly 4 airplanes go wrong. They go rogue. They're not following the plan. They're following another plan that's been introduced, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. They had to ground all the planes, to just start to figure out what on earth was going on with the air traffic control system. That's a relatively simple system, where you can imagine in the immune system, enormously complex system, you introduce some elements that are, work completely in a completely different way. There's a lot of potential for confusion there. And in fact, that's what we're seeing when we look at a lot of the research studies that are coming out now, that there's quite a large degree of immune dysfunction involved with introducing this mRNA technology. And what are the long-term consequences of that? Yeah, well, we're only just beginning to find out.
I just want to talk about the children. I mean, not so long ago, we used to protect our children. I mean, and I heard that, I mean, I don't know if it's 1 or 2 weeks since in Australia, they are giving these injections from a year, from they are babies. And if you don't do it, they won't give you any vad heter det? If you have the money, the monthly paid from the government, they keep it away from you. I mean, and the situation, I mean, with all the things you're talking about, and on top of that, are kind of risking our children for something that we don't know? What we'll do with a human?
Well, I think it's well established that the injury rate and the fatality rate for children, especially very young children, are so very, very small that there can be no real justification for the use of a experimental product like this, which is not going to make any significant impact on either of those measured endpoints or anything else that you'd want to know about. And again, traditionally, most of the time that these products have been used, it's generally has been in the either the older population or with inherently reduced immunity, or it has been in those who have a number of other chronic medical conditions and makes them more susceptible to damage from a vaccine or a virus injury of something of that nature. And so we have a problem with that from the outset. Is how can you be proposing a product of this type when you have almost no significant morbidity and mortality from it in the first place?
Children. I call it the shield argument. The children aren't at risk, but some adults have been convinced that they're at risk, and they become afraid of their own children, so they send their children along to receive the this technology, and so they're using children as a shield. That's despicable. And you know, the historical parallels are obvious. You only have to look at the history in Europe in the the middle of last century. It's this is a area where there's been this huge drift. Medical ethics and the medical assessment of risk. This is not something new with the pandemic. This has been going on for a long time. There has been a drift into acceptable, higher and higher levels of risk being acceptable, and smaller margins of improvement. So you're looking at some pharmaceutical interventions that have very minor effects on the condition, quite serious side effects. And, we've reached a situation where in 2017, the pharmaceutical medical misadventure became the third leading cause of death. And that really is a slide in effort. Now, what we've seen here is a big jump. A lot of ethical principles have been thrown out, and the amount of risk that people judged is acceptable has increased dramatically. We're seeing levels of adverse effects 30 to 50 times any other previous intervention of this type. So, we should be very concerned about this. We should be very concerned when we're seeing deaths in people who are having medical interventions. They should be paused. There are methods of assessment, long-term methods of assessment, because there are secondary effects. Peter will be familiar with these things. You can have mutagenic events with some medicines, and they're going to show up years down the road. So that's why most pharmaceutical products are subject to very long testing protocols, because they're looking at these the incidence of secondary effects against the background rates with populations.
And there are many late effects that have been known to occur only after years in the conventional products of this type, or conventional products using the conventional technology, not even this new technology. And autoimmune disease is a big one. The effects of having depressed immunity from these inoculations that's already been recorded as showing marked increases in viral diseases previously kept in check. So, for example, shingles outbreaks are significantly increased in those who have undergone this inoculation series, and even increases in cancers that were not seen to anywhere near the same degree. And for example, Dr. Ryan Cole's laboratory reports from Idaho in the United States. And the number of adverse effects already that has been admitted to by the major producer of this product in New Zealand goes on for pages and pages, to 12,000 potential side effects or something of that nature. And so that, and the fact that we know that the manufacturers of these products have been given freedom from any liability for injuries from their products begins to tell us how the story got to come to this, the status that we're in now is that, you know, when companies have no risk of liability for injuries from their products, then the profit motives can run freely. And then when you have the conjugation of corporate interests with government policy through these incestuous relationships, then you kind of reach the point where we find ourselves today.
You know, one of the things is this is very joyless. You know, it sort of becomes very serious, doesn't it? We're talking about the side effects, and it's a particular characteristic of the pandemic that has become a very sort of gray and joyless time. You know, when you think of things that could be used, you know, improvements in diet, exercise, nutrition, yoga, meditation, that are actually, there are studies, you know, Ayurvedic herbs that are proving that they really do mitigate the circumstances that people find themselves in. Now, these approaches are not just remedial, but they give people joy. They give people a sense of progress. You know, I'm sure that the World Health Organization doesn't have its full quota of nutritionists, yoga teachers, meditation teachers, and personal trainers. I think they need a few more, because these are the things that work. When you look at these giant studies on cancer and other serious illnesses, if people have organic food and they have their 5 servings of fresh fruit and vegetables a day, they're far more healthy. They're enjoying themselves more. You know, this whole thing, medical nightmare, it is a joyless nightmare, and we're being pushed into it more and more. This has to stop. We have to find the things that give us joy. I'm sure in Sweden you're absolutely aware, as most people are all over the world, that, you know, of course we should be enjoying ourselves. Of course we should be finding those sources of joy and health and happiness, and that, you know, we have to have an integrated approach to life. We can't isolate ourselves in these small boundaries and quake in fear. This is not necessary in this situation. There are remedies that are available.
But if we now go back to you and the situation, especially, I mean, New Zealand, I mean, Sweden went another way. I mean, there's so many similarities, but you've been isolated, really. And I want to go to you, Peter, because I also know that in November they did something to you. I mean,
yeah. Well, back in June of last year, I was asked to give a talk on COVID-19 and the response to it on the part of the government here, and what the products were that they had in mind to deal with it. And because I was accustomed to doing lecture preparation for the medical registrars and all of that, and I had the facilities to do it, I just sort of went about it and said, all right, I'll make up a slideshow, and went through that. It was well received here in New Plymouth. And then I was asked by the founders of this organization, Voices for Freedom, to do that and actually take it on the road. So I did, for 2 separate tours, and gave a total of 17 in-person presentations at various towns throughout New Zealand, mostly in the North Island. and then had set to do one in Auckland, which was going to be our largest group yet. And then the lockdowns appeared. So we went online and started in a webinar series at first, then with that presentation that I had been giving. And then over the following weeks and months, I'd given 15 preparations. As I consider myself really a news aggregator or just a presenter. I don't, I'm not a researcher myself, but it found a fruitful, it bore fruit with people's interest to try to have a different viewpoint presented to them compared to what they were getting from the conventional sources. So I was effectively speaking out, and I had become available and known, and certain people in the public audiences had complained about that and stated, well, you're giving misinformation. Of course, they were not trained medically, and they just didn't like what I was saying, and it was against the government narrative, and so they thought it must be misinformation. They reported it to the Medical Council of New Zealand, which is in effect, the licensing agency for physicians, surgeons, and so on. And so they then began their investigation and found that because I was stating things, however well referenced I was trying to make them from the medical literature, they said, well, you're giving misinformation. They wouldn't say why, but they just had stated that I was speaking misinformation. I was against the government narrative. I was an anti-vaxxer, and so on. And they then decided that they were going to suspend my practice certificate. And that's what they did back in November. And so even though we had asked on several occasions, well, what is it that I said that you felt was misinformation? They never really responded to that. I said, well, we really have an issue with freedom of expression and freedom of speech here. And those are supposed to be protected by the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act of 1990, which is quite clear about what we should be allowed to say, unless we're saying something which is, clearly, there to incite riots and all of that. But I was just trying to present information. We decided to appeal this case, and we did in December, along with another colleague of mine who's also quite outspoken on this matter and has, as I have, felt that we have moral obligations to discuss the potential risks of this procedure as well as the benefits. So we both had a hearing back in February relative to this appeal against the suspension of our practice certificates. And about 10 days ago, we had results from the judge who has determined that the decision to suspend the practicing capabilities for the other doctor and myself was not proportionate to their concern. In other words, the judge sustained our appeal and stated that the medical council overstepped their authority by suspending our licenses. And so that's where we are at the moment. We have submitted additional material that relates to the judge's order, which has not yet been given. And so we have made some submissions in that regard, because it's one thing to say, well, it was not proportionate to take away your medical practice license. But on the other hand, the medical council might engage and ask me to sign voluntarily as what's called a voluntary undertaking, whereby I would be limited in what I could say. Or they would say, well, you're not allowed to speak at all on this topic, which again would be, I think, to the average observer, would be, again, a violation of that New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. So the story is not finished yet, but we do hope that we'll have some guidance that will allow me to continue to speak in this way, and especially others who have also been, cowed into a fearful state as practicing doctors, because all doctors in New Zealand have effectively become threatened by this very matter of certain things you're not allowed to say. And as doctors, we're supposed to speak to our patients about the risks as well as the benefits. We're supposed to provide the patient is supposed to provide informed consent. But if we can't inform them, then they can't give informed consent. And if we do not follow our Hippocratic oath, which is to say, first, do no harm, then again, we cannot be practicing ethically. And I think that's been the dilemma we've been placed under, is that, well, okay, if we wish to follow the oath and to do no harm, and that means we have to talk about risks and benefits and what's best for this particular patient that's in front of me. And if we can't do that, then we can't do the most essential ethical requirement of our profession.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
these go on. These ethics, they're extending, beyond the boundaries of medical risk as well. The whole network, the biotechnology endeavor that's going on all over the world is a very risky endeavor. And we're seeing here a virus that was highly likely to have been created in a laboratory. It has some very novel sequences that are recognizable and has been known for a long time and are not naturally occurring. And these novel sequences have occurred together, which the odds against this happening are very long indeed. So we're seeing the creation of an illness, and then we're very rapidly seeing the creation of a technology that is being suggested might deal with it. The two may very well have developed together. It's this is an evolution of warfare. Actually, this is the warfare of the serial killer. The serial killer doesn't mind who they kill. Any victim will do. And when we see these kind of huge risks being introduced, we're seeing total war, in the sense that things are being created that could kill friend and foe. There's a history here of military interest in biotechnology. There are a lot of vested interests in biotechnology. There are military, there are financial, they're involved in sort of playing God, of having the glory of created something that's better than the human being. These are dangerous notions. And who rules the world? Actually, the sun. We all get up in the morning when the sun rises, except, of course, if you live in the far north of Sweden. But nature are ruling, actually. There's a wonderful model there. When you look at modern physics, you see this sort of core of supersymmetry at the center of all the laws of nature. You see this enormous sort of body of harmony, of oneness. And we're really a reflection of that. We have this sense of oneness in ourselves. And we're a reflection, we're a child of natural law. We have to start to model our governing institutions upon that. They need to be more nourishing and more representative. We need to look closely at the laws of nature, the laws of physics, and start to design our political systems to be more protective, to be more nourishing, to offer the choice. Peter was talking about the need for choice, and it's absolutely essential, because out of choice, people have a right to choose, but also, if you just have a one size fits all, these are the kind of systems that fail. When you have the medical systems and political systems, educational systems, where everybody is treated in exactly the same way, it really stifles who people are. And these are all lessons that are coming out of the pandemic, and they're all pointing towards the need for change. And I work, have worked over the years a lot with young people. I'm always very well aware that young people have a more of a sense of humanity, because we have traveled more, we've met more people, we've gone to different countries, and people are, the same in different countries. They have the same kind of humanity and joy in them. And then imposed on this a kind of global power structures that are really outdated, where you have a small cadre of people who are able to sort of move populations against one another and encourage people to see other people as enemies and so on and so forth. These are totally outdated in the modern world. We have to start to, get our inner resources so that we can recognize the commonalities, not start to think in terms of enemies and scapegoats. And this has to change. And this is another lesson. It might be a hard lesson, I mean, we've been really schooled all our lives that, the Russians are coming over the next hill, we better beware. But actually, there was a time when I went to work in the Soviet Union briefly on an earthquake project. And people, there's joy there, and people everywhere. There's commonality. We have to discover that.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at some of the movies that were created in the Soviet Union during that time, it really gives you insight into the sense of humor that was maintained throughout that very dark period. And I know this because my wife was raised in the Soviet Union, but I mean, if there's a film, Vasily Vasilyevich, and it's about this Tsar who comes back in the modern times, and it's really quite a comedy, but it pokes fun at the various elements of the Soviet society at the time, and it's that matter of joy that we come back to that topic that Guy has mentioned, and it occurred to me that the whole capacity for joy and for the aspect of life that we want to maintain, that we want to strive for, really does depend on and is very closely related to that of individual choice. And we talked about individual choice in regard to this narrative of, well, we must all take this inoculation and we don't have a choice about it. Well, that's part of where that joyless thing comes in, that Dr. Hatchard was mentioning, is that if you don't have a choice, then we don't have our own capacity to chart our own course. And with that, we're going to lose that sense of joy. If we can't have an effect on our lives, we can't affect our lives. We can't make the choices in our lives. So I think those two topics are related.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to go back to you, Peter. I mean, they took your medical license for you speaking out, and even if it's to what we're talking about here, I mean, it's important to feel joy and happiness and I mean all the good things in life. I mean, this is a reality. The media, if you just look at the media, they don't want you to be happy. I mean, we have a doctor in Sweden, and I mean, like every week she's on the big newspaper talking about that food don't matter. You can drink wine. You don't need to drink water. And I mean, I guess it was like for you too. I mean, from the early, like March 2020, they told us here in Sweden, you don't need D vitamin. It's dangerous. You can overdose it. I mean, this is the narrative. And then back to you, Peter. I mean, you stood up for what you think and what you believe. And they took your license. I mean,
well, but they didn't take my integrity.
No. No,
they did not. Peter really stood out.
I mean, only I could give that up, and I'm not volunteering to do that. And you see, I mean, that's the thing, that you can have the joy that you stood up to that. I've been actually challenged. You can go along in life, and if you've not been challenged, then you really don't know what your own substance is like. I mean, it's when you are challenged that you find out what you're made of. And I'm just, I don't know, I couldn't do otherwise. I don't know. I've reached a point in my life too where, I'm in my later years, to be sure, in regard to the years of my career. And, would it have been different if I were 45 years old and I had, a 10-year-old and, or a 17-year-old, they were facing university tuition? I hope I would have made the same decision. I hope that I would have. And I can just only imagine how difficult it must be. In fact, more difficult for those who are in that position now, those doctors who have made those decisions. And they've stood up to a larger challenge than I have, really. I mean, perhaps they haven't been speaking out in the webinars as I have, but they also are on the firing line from the medical council if they discuss with their patients, as they should, the full benefits, risks, and individual determination whether they themselves have conditions that should exempt them from such an inoculation. Well, we have a number in our group, which is called the New Zealand Doctors Speaking Out with Science, who are in that position. And there are nearly 100, I think, who are practicing physicians, surgeons, ophthalmologists, dentists, and oral surgeons, and so on that have been in that position. And it's really devastating when you think about it. What has been allowed to happen, something that I don't any of us would have considered could happen in this, democratic, free, Western democracy. We would not have thought it ever possible.
No, we wouldn't. I mean, it's so unthinkable. I mean, you often talk to your friends and say, who would have thought? Who would have thought this would ever have happened? It doesn't seem believable, but it is driven by a loss of a free press and we have weaknesses in our constitution. We're an immature constitution here in New Zealand, and probably in a number of Commonwealth countries like Canada and Australia, where we used to have, we used to have a sort of British law, and British law has an element in it called common law, which dates right back to Magna Carta, where the judges uphold what people think is fair and right. And so they, in a sense, they determine some elements of law. They assess law to see whether it's fair and right between man and the state, or man and woman, of course, in these days. But that was guaranteed by a link with British law, and that got dissolved. And we never had a constitution. We're a young country. We began in the 1840s. And we have a weak constitution. The government, the parliament, same thing in Canada, is absolutely powerful. They can pass any law. The government could pass a law that everybody, when they see green, they have to say blue. And under our constitutional practice, the courts would have to uphold that. They would fine people if they didn't say blue and instead say green. So it's an absolute kind of power that the government had that up until recently was sort of respected. But suddenly our government realized that they could just flex their muscles. They could do whatever they wanted. It's very immature. There are stakeholders in government, scientists, educators, business people, and so on. We're all stakeholders in a nation. And that respect for those stakeholders has gone. There is a polarization, a determination to force things through. This produces a high level of stress in society. And I no doubt that we're seeing that in Europe at the moment, that there's a high level of stress. It's erupted just like a boil erupts on the surface of the skin when the body's not working right. We have to, you know, address that fact that there has been some polarization that has to get resolved. You have to be able to see other people's point of view. Absolutely. Because otherwise it's a very rocky road.
Yeah, I think on the Commonwealth nations, the countries, there's been that tradition, which is, while it has been apparently ignored, at least in the current iteration, I don't think it's been dissolved. At least I know there are movements within New Zealand as well as other Commonwealth countries to bring some of those basic skeletal structures of the legal system in New Zealand and elsewhere back into operation. Now, how successful that's going to be, I think that remains to be seen, but there's certainly burgeoning interest in doing so, in bringing back some of the essential elements that upon which law had originally been based. So I think, you know, we are discovering that there are certain aspects of the way that things run now, which maybe need to be questioned and looked into in detail, and to see how solid they really are, how solid their capacity to, you know, pass all these regulations really is. But I may be speaking a bit in, you know, in a way where I don't have all the information, or I'm just noting that there has been a movement, there have been several movements to try to look at that very question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because there are pivotal moments in nations. There are pivotal moments when, you know, something needs to get resolved, and that takes a long time. You know, in America, you have constitution, but then you have constitutional amendments. You have there, in every generation throws up new issues, and you have to work out how to accommodate them. You have to work out with your institutions, your social institutions, your political institutions, your commercial institutions, your scientific institutions, educational institutions, whether these are adequate to the task. Mm-hmm. And I think we've reached that point. I'm sure, you know, in Sweden, we followed from afar, and you've had a lot of debate through the pandemic, how to handle this, how to maintain a sense of normality, but at the same time, maintain a sense of social caring. And, you know, you came in for a lot of criticism at the start, but now the pendulum swung the other way, and maybe you did a lot of things that were right. And, you know, we have to have an open mind here. We're facing something that we haven't faced. And we have to be careful that we don't forget all the good things that we do know. You know, we can't throw out our traditions, our scientific basis of knowledge, our existing understanding of health. That we can't throw all of that out. Our ethical practices are, and so on, but our treatment protocols. That this is not a disease that is that serious that everything has to be forgotten. Absolutely not.
Yeah, but yeah, now we are in that situation where people from the healthcare business say that the natural immune system no longer exists. I mean,
yeah, it's really quite surprising, given the stance that that Sweden had in the beginning with your chief epidemiologist, who was just giving the conventional epidemiologic advice that would have been given. In fact, was also echoed in the Great Barrington Declaration in the United States, which is logically what had always been done in pandemics and epidemics in the past. And so when there has been a change to that, you have to say, well, really, I mean, has it really been such a unique situation here? Or has there been some political machinations behind the scenes that have caused the conventional, historical, and traditional scientific viewpoints to be simply discarded? And I think that's what we're finding, you know, increasingly as we look around in other parts of the world, because, you know, the matter with respect to the efficacy of masks, for example, That had been studied for quite a long time prior to 2020, prior to the emergence of this coronavirus, and where they were known to be ineffective unless you have N95s and you properly fit them, and you'd only use them for a certain number of hours, and then you have to take them off and put them on in a certain way so that you don't contaminate, and all of this. These kinds of things were never being done. And so you have to say, well, why is it that all of a sudden we are told that masks are effective in reducing the transmission of this what we're calling the virus? And it's just another example. Why is it that ordinary medications, which had been quite effective for viruses in the past, why have them not been used now, and why are they ignored? I mean, even in the United States, Dr. Fauci had admitted and had known that, for example, the ivermectin had been used in previous viral diseases. I think it was even either the SARS, maybe it wasn't the SARS, the original SARS, but HIV or one of those. His name is on a paper that shows the effectiveness of that drug. So, how is it that when it comes to the SARS-CoV-2 that has been forgotten? The other thing I was going to say is that all of the rest of the world had been having their experiences with SARS-CoV-2 and its several variants. And here we were in New Zealand with the luxury of saying, well, it hasn't come here. We're going to look and see what happened everywhere else in the world. And having seen that, it appears to me that we just, we didn't seem to want to learn from it. We didn't want to, take the lessons that had been learned in other countries, in Europe and the US and elsewhere, and take that to heart and say, okay, well, now we can adapt a policy here to deal with our country in New Zealand and what will happen when it does come here, because it will come. And it did come. And the whole concept of saying, well, we're going to have a zero COVID policy is, again, that I don't understand how that can be possible. To anyone that's graduated from medical school knows that, and virology and all of epidemiology, we've known that for years. You cannot eliminate and you cannot prevent highly infectious and contagious viruses. You just can't do it. So how we could actually imagine you're going to have that happen? It's not a medical decision. It had to be some other kind of political decision.
Peter, that whole issue of masks, a couple of days ago in the UK, Ofsted, which is the educational regulator, came out with a very, very long report, which was highly critical of mask use for children. They pointed out there were a lot of educational deficits. Kids are more lonely. They are learning to walk at a much older age. They're not seeing the full facial expressions. And again, I thought, here we are, we're in a sort of modern medical dystopia where a very particular point of view in medicine that is not necessarily well-founded in science, as you've just pointed out, is suddenly sort of determining decisions in every aspect of life. And we had our retiring director of public health 2 days ago, Dr. McElnay, saying we expect to see mask wearing in New Zealand normalized and continuing into the future. And that was, to me, that was a frightening kind of assertion of, a very suspect technology, because everybody wearing a mask is got an increased level of carbon dioxide. They've an increased level of bacterial material around their face, and so on and so forth. It doesn't seem to me to be a right decision. That doesn't it just doesn't fit the scientific narrative, but it fits the political narrative. It increases the fear factor. There's disapproval. If you go into, everybody has to wear a mask. There's the law here. If you go into a shop, you're supposed to wear a mask, and you can get a mask exemption. But if you do use it, you go into a shop. I mean, I was in a shop the other day, and in fact, I was wearing a mask, but there were a couple of other people who were not wearing a mask. There was a lady in the back of the store who suddenly had a fit. I mean, she started shouting that you're all going to get sick, you're all going to die. If you take off these masks, you'll die. You know, I mean, she was having a psychological breakdown there.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a level of it was a measure of the manipulation that the psychological manipulation that the situation has had. There's a certain amount of mass neuroses here. That's going to take a long time to get rid of it, but it has to go.
Yeah, I mean, a 300% increase in referrals to speech therapists for young children because they don't develop speech with the mask use. It's actually child abuse, you know, and it's systemic child abuse instituted by, you know, by government, and it's unfathomable how they got to this point. But as you say, it's related to this mass psychosis that has been induced in the population very effectively. And the difficulty the concern I have is that you can show all of the data and all the evidence that you want that shows that this particular product is not effective in reducing transmission. It's not effective in reducing hospitalizations. In fact, now we're getting to see it's not even effective in reducing the death rates. And in fact, there's from some of the work that Dr. Hetch has been doing, it may in fact increase the all-cause mortality. You can point all of this information out. You can show them the studies, the documents, the medical references, the peer-reviewed literature. And it's like talking to a stone. I mean, that people won't accept it. They won't acknowledge it. And that's what I find to be the worrisome thing, because if you ever try to determine how are you going to correct this dystopian situation that we're in, it's going to involve opening the eyes of large numbers of people. And there's a significant proportion of people who simply you cannot reach. And I think that's the fear I have. That's the most concern I have, really.
Yeah, because the things happening here now are not logic. And you were talking about the speech for the children. And my middle son has some speaking problem. So he's going to a logoped. I don't know the English word, but when I went there, it's not so restricted now, but not so long time ago, I went there, and one of the women coming out, calling for a child to get in. I mean, she had both this shield and a mask, and I was like, how on earth are you gonna learn a child to speak if the child can't see you? I mean, this is so unlogical, and I felt so sad. I mean, my child, he had a better woman. I mean, she just had this, but still, I mean, he was frightened by this.
So
you talk about child abuse. I mean, I saw this woman walking with her newborn child outside in this winter, and she had a mask.
On the child?
No, on herself. But I mean, she was like looking at the small baby all the time, and I mean, so what the baby? I mean, I know I had 3 children. I know how much they look at you all the time,
yes.
and I mean, the half of the face is
the
gone.
most important part for communication, after all, is now covered. And yes, we must learn according to, seeing the facial expressions. And that's a huge part of communication, and it's covered up. And I think we get to the point where people just have to say, well, no, we're not doing this. This is criminal. You ought to know it's criminal. Do I need to explain to you why it's criminal? And you know, we have to as a collective of people who are aware of this situation, we have to make our stand. And you know what's interesting, it seems to me, is that, you know, when you have one brave person in a supermarket or in a, you know, a shop or whatever, that is not wearing their mask and smiling, then, you know, it's easy to actually imagine you're going to be able to have other people say, well, you know, I really don't like this mask. Maybe I can take it off. You know, so you start with these sort of small steps for those who have the courage, and it becomes infectious because everybody, if they are wearing the masks, is under duress of some kind. And if you're a person who's not under duress, you're a person that's actually taking the joy of it and being normal, everything that we consider to be, you know, the best part of a normal life in previous years. Well, we must not forget that.
Absolutely.
So if we kind of put this this conversation together, I mean, and because I always think, I mean, you're into this already, Peter, but I mean, everybody needs this joy. I mean, what is the solution? I mean, on all this, I mean, you have a situation in New Zealand, we have a situation here in Sweden, but I mean, we're actually all one. I mean, this is going on the whole world, in the whole world.
And despite the fact that the powers that be are trying to separate us, and they try to isolate us, we can't let them do that. And so, you know, I think that there are some institutions everywhere that have managed to have a path where they have, through this pandemic period, they have not complied with these draconian requirements. Now, whether it's shops or restaurants or churches, I mean, you see within each category of institutions within a society, some of them, small number perhaps, small percentage perhaps, but in every one of those categories of institutions, you can find those that have decided they're not going to knuckle under to this sort of tyrannical views. And those are the ones that we need to remember now, as in many parts of the world, these restrictions are being lifted. And we have to remember who was with us when it mattered the most. Who was it that respected our freedoms when it mattered the most? And those are the institutions that we need to go back to and to actually get our friends to. The ones who, by the way, as our friends now, may be quite different to the friends that we had before. But we now gather them together in the places that we have all experienced, were those who stood up for human freedom. And again, that's how we get through this, is we encourage people, we reward those who did the right thing, and then grow that feeling and that way of living.
We should avoid there's a certain kind of way of thinking when we look at this is a global problem. You're absolutely right. And there are a lot of global problems. There are microplastics, there are overfishing, there's climate change, there's weapons proliferation. There are a lot of global problems. And I think, a lot of people think, well, we need a global administrative structure and we need global regulations. And it sounds, on the face of it, it sounds to make a lot of sense. But when you start to look at regulatory structures sort of sitting out there in the global environment, they're very undemocratic and they tend to grow. And they're actually not very effective. They start to facilitate things happening. You know, you see these regulatory authorities, you know, in atomic energy, and now with bioweapons and biolabs, and actually there are more and more and more. Even there have been regulations. You have to also find the success stories. I mean, one of the success stories in terms of global problems has been the CFCs that have driven the hole in the ozone layer. They were just stopped. You know, if something is dangerous to life, it has to be stopped. And this is that drift of medical kind of ethics and environmental ethics that we talked about earlier on. If you start to think, well, they're going to be regulated, you may be actually going down completely a wrong path. There are some things that just can't be, that have gone too far and have to be stopped now. They have to be stopped in some way or another. And it's a question of knowledge. When people really understand things, we have to have a system of getting more knowledge out about them, normalizing that knowledge, supporting that knowledge, rather than supporting, you know, the economic system is geared to support people who are going to make profits come what may. And yeah, there's a balance there. There's a balance between knowledge, business, administration of society, labor, and so on. There are all these elements in society. When one viewpoint dominates, then you get this imbalance. So there has to be a pendulum that swings back towards knowledge. It can't be a closed system. It can't be a system where a very small number of people regulate and decide things. Somehow or other, we have to discover those. I'm not saying I have the answers necessarily, but I think a lot of young people sense that there are answers. You know, they have that sense of a bigger horizon in life and a more of a sense of global citizenship. I think we have to find ways to harness that and to put systems into education that develop people more fully. These are big challenges, but ones that we possibly can't duck. That's how I see it. And let joy guide us. You know, things that are right they're joyful.
And you speak about the regulatory agencies and their inherent tendency to grow almost to the point, well, in fact, often to the point where they're no longer functional. And you know, they have a life of their own, and it's like a if I may use the term, it's like a cancer, isn't it? I mean, it sort of grows uncontrolled and often in many ways. But what's interesting too is that the regulatory agencies are usually seated by or staffed by the very companies and corporate entities that they're supposed to regulate. And so you have this revolving door going back and forth between the regulatory agencies and the corporations that are supposed to be regulated. And that becomes like a club of, well, you know, when you're done with your regulatory role, we've got a very lucrative position for you on the corporate board or whatever it may be. And so, you know, the whole concept of whether regulatory agencies are fit for purpose in the 21st century is up for grabs. I mean, and it seems increasingly, and we've certainly seen this in the United States, where regulatory agents have been captured, and we can't count on them to do what they were supposed to be doing anymore. And you know, you see some of that very exquisitely discussed in Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s recent book on the real Anthony Fauci. I mean, that was just a stunning look into the inner world of the National Institutes of Health and you know, the health agencies, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and all of those, which are tasked with keeping us, quote, safe, unquote, from, you know, pharmaceutical products and in this case these inoculations that we've been talking about.
Absolutely.
So you both, are you, I mean, do you think this situation will end well? I mean, but will we go to a better point?
We're all, we're all hopeful, aren't we? But actually, it's up to us. People have to stand up in larger numbers. It can't be a bystander here. And again, you've just got to look to history, really. I mean, you know the situation as we built up towards war in Europe, and a lot of people stood on the sidelines and said, "I'm sure it won't get any worse." And I think I agree with Peter. You have points in life when you're faced with very stark choices, and how you handle yourself at those moments, how you respond to them, defines you. So people have to speak up, and I'm not talking here, about protest per se. I'm talking about knowledge. If someone says something stupid, you have to call them out. You can't just sort of be embarrassed and keep quiet and feel, oh, that guy, I don't know. No, you have to. It's like being a parent. If you have children, sometimes you have to guide, and that's where we're at. How much we're able to guide in kindness and knowledge will get us through this.
It's ironic that the major theme of our government leaders has been to be kind, in the context of this pandemic, and the various responses to it. And the way to look at that, and this is sort of the theme of one of our presenters on the Voices for Freedom webinars, is be kind, be blind. Because that seems to be what is being asked for. And what Guy is saying is that, I'd prefer not to have to respond to be kind unless, but I can be, and I'd like to be. But it's more important to be truthful and to be honest, to be forthright. And it's that sort of creeping social, what shall we call it? The assessment that you shouldn't be so blunt, you shouldn't be, so out there, that you should be, it comes back to that statement, well, you shouldn't say anything to anybody unless you can say something nice about them. Well, we have reached a point in our history where that's the result of what, has been the operating way of looking at things for so long. We haven't been able to be truthful. And now when it most counts, we find ourselves in this situation. So we have to kind of make up for lost ground. And I'm sorry, I have to be quite blunt with you, but that's not true. And the reason I need to tell you that is because the consequences of your believing something which is false are too great, not just for you yourself, the person who's undertaken this inoculation, for example, but it's for everyone else around you, because we are a group, we are a society, we are a collection of people, and our individual decisions are going to determine the direction of our country and of effectively the world. So we kind of, at least, I think we have to alter how we deal with other people. You can still be kind and truthful and blunt. But it's not the primary thing to be kind by not telling people what they need to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's challenging because you get rebuffed sometimes, but silence here is just not going to work. It's just not going to work.
And I guess as much as I've been in a public space with my webinars, I'm basically a shy person, and I don't like to offend. I don't like to be blunt or overt with people. But I guess, maybe in some instances it's easier to do that when you're just talking to an audience that you don't see. and you talk truthfully, and you hope that people will get something out of it. But actually, the rubber meets the road in everyday conversations that we have with other people. And that's where that need there is then to overcome some of that innate shyness that we may have about talking to people. I mean, we can look at people and see when they're worried and when they're concerned and when they're fearful and they're wearing a mask. And we kind of, these days, we can often figure out, well, we know what that's about because that's what the movement is. That's what's been surrounding us. And maybe that's a way to open up and say, what we can to them about, I'm sorry you're fearful. I mean, did you know that? Blankety blank, you can say something like that. But, we can never lose our empathy with other people because they did what they thought was the right thing at the time. They may have taken the injections because they were told it was necessary to do so. And we have to recognize that they've made their decisions and there's something that maybe we can help them with, even though maybe they are on an opposite side of the decision-making apparatus.
I think the Voices of Freedom is such a good name. And if I put that together with the thing you said, they can't take my integrity. And I mean, if I kind of combined what we talked about, I mean, that's what it's all about. I mean, if I have my integrity, I can live with myself. I can look myself in the mirror. I can, for me, I mean, it sounds so dramatic, but I mean, I would die for my integrity.
Well, when you have the integrity and you have lived in that way, and perhaps even if you have evolved in your life from having not been quite that way in the past, but now you realize the importance of it, and now you wish to live in that way, then you come closer to being, I guess, satisfied that you have run the course of your life in a way that you were meant to do. And in fact, no one really wants to see the end of their life. But when you live by your integrity, you are going to be better prepared for that. May it come at any time. And of course, it's the truth. I mean, it may come at any time for all of us. So really now is always the time when we want to make sure that we are living with integrity, no matter what our age, no matter what our experiences.
Absolutely. Keep your suitcase packed. You may be going on a trip.
Oh, fantastic, you two. I mean, I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for this conversation.
Yeah, lovely to sit here with Peter. We're in different parts of New Zealand, but we're lovely to sit together with you this evening and feel like we're across the world here. And it helps us down here in New Zealand to feel part of a global family.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah,
thank you both. Well, thank you for all the people who've been watching and thank you so much. And yeah, a nice evening for you too.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Very good.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Take care.